we're good to go, or?
Well, I think Diego's still setting up.
Okay, that's awesome. So it's your call then?
No, just go.
Oh, you're not going to, okay.
Just don't turn off their phones.
Okay. We're good? And voice recording is live?
Yeah, he's said we're ready.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Kate Liska, and I am an associate professor of history and the the Benson and Pamela Herrera Egyptology fellow at the university. So I am very lucky to be able to teach classes on ancient Egypt. And I'm very, very happy to be here at the Robert and Frances Fullerton Museum of Art tonight for what will be a wonderful lecture by the 5th annual W. Benson Herrera Scholar in Residence. So we are very fortunate enough to be able to have a rotating scholar position every year, and we are so happy to have Aleksandra Ksiezak with us tonight. So Aleksandra, as you know, is currently teaching a class at the university called In the Land of Stone and Copper, an Introduction to Ancient Egyptian Technology, which is a fascinating and fun class where you get to learn about materials and, of course, use the lovely objects in the collection at CSUSB. So hopefully all of you who are here in person tonight can also visit the collection on the other side of the wall before you leave too. But she's also a field archaeologist, an Egyptologist, and a ceramicist specializing in macro and microscopic analyses of Egyptian and Nubian pottery. Her research focuses on issues of migration and mobility in antiquity in northwestern Africa, in the Sinai Peninsula, and also in the Levant. She's also interested in broader questions of social and economic relations across the continent and the context of migration and the development and maintenance of trade networks in the Near East and Middle East too. She has a BA and MA from the University of Warsaw, and she has a PhD from the University of Toronto. Her dissertation was on the ceramic materials from the Second Intermediate Period Hyksos settlement at Tel el-Maskuta that were excavated by the Wadi Tumilat project. So we're very happy for her to be talking about this project with us tonight, both by looking at the past excavations and also excavating older excavations for us too. So welcome.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I don't think I need the mic.
This is for the internet.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Is it off? Good evening, everyone. I'm very happy to be here and talk to you about my research on the Wadi Tumilat, which was also, as Kate mentioned, the subject of my doctoral dissertation, and still an ongoing interest since the topic is vast and I have barely scratched the surface of it in my research so far. So just to start, the majority of my work on the site of Tel el-Maskuta and the Wadi Tumilat itself in general is based on the archival documentation of the Wadi Tumilat project. The project was a joint mission of RC, ASOR, and University of Toronto, directed by the late Professor Jack Holliday, over here. It began its first field season in 1977 and continued the work in the Wadi and excavations at Tel el-Maskuta for five seasons between 1978 and 1985. In the meantime, conducting several surveys of the Wadi, which were directed by Carol Redmount. Unfortunately, since then, very little of the material was actually published. Fortunately, I was at the right place at the right time, and I was entrusted with this material a few years before Jack's passing. The Wadi Tumilat today is a narrow, intensively cultivated valley, which is some 52 kilometers long, but only 2 to 6 kilometers wide, leading eastward from the town of Abasa to Ismaïlia and the shores of Lake Timsah. It is one of the two main overland routes leading from the Nile Delta into the Sinai and Western Asia, and it is heavily traversed today. Geologically, Wadi Tumilat is an ancient bed of a large Pleistocene river, which is down cutting through earlier Plio-Pleistocene deltaic sands and gravels, which today form the northern portion of the eastern desert. The wadi is bound to the north by Tel el-Kebir Island, a turtle bag of the before-mentioned sands and gravels, and to the south by a line of ever-moving sand dunes bounding the northern edge of a flat, level desert. Wadi Tumilat was a strategically important corridor in and out of Egypt from the pre-dynastic period until the early Middle Ages. This trade route was initially facilitated by the Bedouin and the nomadic inhabitants of the Sinai Peninsula via donkey caravans, but was eventually supplemented by a waterway, the so-called Canal of the Pharaohs, which increasingly became a significant strategic resource. The Wadi Tumilat and its importance did not escape the attention of the ancient rulers, historians, and geographers. Several written sources mention the area, all focusing on the ancient canal that ran through it. The oldest written record of the waterway existing in the Wadi Tumilat comes from the 4 commemorative stelae of Darius I, all of which were erected along the wadi. Each stela was made of granite and was inscribed on both sides in hieroglyphic and cuneiform texts, Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian. The information on the cutting of the canal is given by the hieroglyphic version, which is unfortunately very poorly preserved with many missing fragments, in addition to being very hard to interpret. Since then, numerous ancient authors have mentioned the wadi and its canal in their writings. Some of the records are more detailed than others. However, they are all very inconsistent and very frequently contradictory. Despite their shortcomings, once taken with a grain of salt, these sources allow us to gain insight into the history of the canal and allow us to study its history. The so-called Canal of the Pharaohs was the forerunner of the Suez Canal, which was kept in use with intermissions from the 2nd millennium BCE until the year 767 CE, when it closed for good. Although it is considered an ancient counterpart of the modern Suez Canal, the Canal of the Pharaohs followed a different course and linked the Nile to the Red Sea via the Wadi Tumilat. We are still not sure who began working on the canal, however. Ancient authors and historians, such as Aristotle, suggested that perhaps its construction was started as early as during the 12th dynasty by Senwosret II or III, who began but did not finish the project. Aristotle's theory was supported by Strabo and Pliny the Elder. However, most of the ancient historians claim that the canal was probably first cut or at least begun by Necho II in the late 7th century BCE, and it was either redug or probably completed by Darius the Great. Necho's involvement in the works in the Wadi are supported by Herodotus, Diodorus Siculus, and Strabo, although these authors seem to agree that the Saite works were also never completed. The majority of the ancient authors writing about the Wadi agree that the first successful cutting of the canal all the way to the Red Sea took place during the Persian conquest under the reign of King Darius I. This feat is supported by the before-mentioned stelae commemorating the monumental achievement, which are known collectively as Darius the Great's Suez inscriptions. They were found in various states of preservation, and one of them, luckily, is known from Tel Maskuta. It reads, "Saith Darius the king, I am a Persian from Persia. I seized Egypt. I gave the order to dig this canal from a river by the name Nile, which flows in Egypt, to the sea which goes from Persia. Afterwards, this canal was dug, thus as I had ordered, and ships went from Egypt through the canal to Persia." Probably unaware of the existence of the stelae of Darius I, Diodorus Siculus, Strabo, and Pliny the Elder claimed that the Persian king also failed at reaching the Red Sea and stated that it was done only under Ptolemy II. His own stela, found at Tel Maskuta and named the Pithom stela by Naville, proclaims this by saying, In the year 16, the third month of His Majesty, they dug a canal to please the heart of his father Atum, the great god, the living of Tekut, in order to bring the gods to Hend-Ab. Its beginning is the river arm north of Heliopolis. Its end is in the Lake of the Scorpion. It runs towards the great wall of its eastern side, the height of which is 100 cubits verily, in order to drive away the rebels from these gods. Although Ptolemy claims that this canal reached the Isthmus of Suez and allowed him to establish a large city dedicated to his sister Arsinoe, it is likely that this ruler only redug a silted-up canal that was already built under the reign of Darius I. During the 2nd century CE, the freshwater canal was called the River of Trajan, and according to Claudius Ptolemaeus, it started right from the main Nile stream, north of the city of Babylon, the Egyptian Babylon. The last known direct reference to a functional canal through the Wadi Tumilat in the Roman period comes from the records of Lucian of Samosata, a public official and author in Egypt under the rule of the Antonines in 170 CE, who traveled from Alexandria to Clysma at the Gulf of Suez via the Wadi Tumilat. Little is known of the conditions of the canal after that, although several papyri from around 423 to 24 CE mention some maintenance work that has been carried out as late as in the late 5th century CE. Unfortunately, these papyri do not mention if the canal was preserved in its entirety at the time. Lastly, there are several sources written by Islamic authors who mention the canal. They generally agree that what its course was, the dates of its opening and closing, and that by the mid-7th century CE it was completely silted up. Its brief reopening in 1641 or 642, CE was credited to the conqueror and governor of Egypt, Amr ibn Ben As. It remained operational until the year 767 CE, when it was closed by the second Abbasid Caliph, Abu Jafr al-Mansur. The real history of the Canal of the Pharaohs was most likely a combination of all of the above achievements, and its final form was a result of the efforts of all of the mentioned rulers, and possibly those predating them by centuries. A much more modest irrigation canal was likely cut along the Wadi to support settlements in its arid central and eastern sections as early as during the Hyksos occupation of the Nile Delta in the Middle Bronze Age. But let's circle back to that later. After antiquity, the eastern Nile Delta fell out of scientific focus and did not draw any historical, cultural, or economic interest from Egyptologists or other Western academics for several centuries. It took an interesting turn of events to propel considerable scientific, scholarly, and popular attention of the Western world towards this region of Egypt. During a secret meeting of the Republic's Executive Directory that took place at the Luxembourg Palace on April 12, 1798, the French government finalized a deferral of a projected invasion of the British Isles. Instead, the directors decided to deliver an indirect blow against England and mount an expedition to Egypt under the command of General Bonaparte. Its main goals were to weaken the British position in the east by fighting the Mamluk Beys who, according to the directory, quote, oppressed French interests and most horribly maltreated French nationals residing in Egypt, end quote. Taking control of Egypt would also aid French commerce and communications with India, threatened by the British occupation of the Dutch Cape of Good Hope. It became necessary for the French to open a shorter, safer route to India that, aside from allowing better access to the Far East, would also allow them to, quote, attack the British satellites and wrest from England the source of her corrupt riches, end quote. The French forces landed in Alexandria on July 1st, 1798, 36,000 men strong, borne in an armada of 400 ships. It was only 20 days later that Napoleon defeated the rulers of Egypt in the Battle of the Pyramids, establishing French domination over the country. Soon, Napoleon turned his attention towards Wadi Tumilat. Having heard stories of an ancient canal, Napoleon expressed interest in finding the remnants of the passage. This culminated in a force of archaeologists, scientists, cartographers, and engineers scouring northern Egypt. Their findings, recorded in the Description de l'Égypte, include detailed maps that depict the discovery of an ancient canal extending northward from the Red Sea and then westward towards the Nile. Later, Napoleon, who became the French emperor in 1804, contemplated the construction of a north-south canal to connect the Mediterranean with the Red Sea. But the plan was abandoned because it incorrectly concluded that the waterway would require locks to operate, the constructions of which would be costly and time-consuming. Even if Napoleon's interest in the Wadi Tumilat was largely militaristic, the records of his surveyors and engineers are invaluable in reconstructing the course and longevity of the Canal of the Pharaohs. Thanks to the records of his engineers, we, for example, know that as late as 1861, the ancient waterway still channeled some water in spots as far east as Casacin. After centuries of being absent from historical and geographical sources, the Canal of the Pharaohs reappears in 1822 in the records of Jacques-Marie Lapeyre, a French civil engineer tasked with surveying the eastern Nile Delta. Before the discovery of the Ramesside remains at the site, Tel el-Maskuta was known as Abu Kashab or Abu Kichaid. As Lapeyre recalls, quote, "The ruins considered as Abu Kichaid bore all the characteristics of an Egyptian city, and at their center stood a very remarkable Egyptian monument, a monolith of red granite sculpted in form of an armchair on which 3 Egyptian figures are seated, that apparently belong to the priesthood as one may judge from their costumes and headdresses they wear. The monument is still standing upright and the figures are facing east. They were buried up to the waist, but as we dug down to the feet, we've been able to see the whole of them and measure them. The back of the armchair seat is completely covered with hieroglyphs that appear to be regular and complete. Among the ruins are many blocks of sandstone and red granite inscribed with hieroglyphs, all of such remains that mark the sites of destroyed cities in Lower Egypt." After that discovery was made, the name figuring on the back and the names figuring on the backs of the statue deciphered, French engineers began to refer to the site of Ramses. This identification and the location of the site itself was one of the reasons why Tel el-Maskuta was quickly equated with the biblical city of Pithom. Pithom was one of the cities which, according to Exodus 1:11, were built for Pharaoh of the oppression by the forced labor of the Israelites. Here's the site still called Abu Kichaid, as recorded in 1818 along the remains of the ancient Suez Canal. And another one from 1826. Towards the end of the 19th century, the French name Ramses was already well established, as seen here on the 1886 map of Lower Egypt by the Geographic Society of Toulouse. Around 50 years later, after the French expedition abandoned the idea of constructing a canal in the Wadi Tumilat, the International Commission for the Piercing of the Isthmus of Suez began building a canal between the Red and the Mediterranean Sea under the direction of Ferdinand de Lesseps, the initiator of the project. This wild-scale project triggered another wave of surveys and rekindled interest in the Wadi Tumilat. A crucial utilitarian element of maintaining a project of this magnitude was the construction of the so-called Sweetwater Canal in the Wadi Tumilat. Its completion assured that the construction site had access to sweet water flowing into the Wadi from the Nile Valley, which in turn allowed the Suez Canal Company to employ a larger number of workers. The Sweetwater Canal was also used to transport materials, food, and tools to the work zone between Kantara and Lake Timsa, where another service canal was constructed. This Sweetwater Canal reached the Red Sea from the north and was accompanied by a railroad which was used during the construction process and involved freight rail cars adapted to earthworks, for which the chief engineer and amateur archaeologist Félix Paponneau received a patent later on. This renewed interest in Tel el-Maskuta was caused by new discoveries made by Paponneau during the construction of the Sweetwater Canal. While the Wadi and its antiquities were already documented thanks to the French expeditions, relatively little was known about individual archaeological sites in the area. During the second phase of building the Sweetwater Canal, between 1874 and 1877, Papenot ordered the construction of the so-called European village at the site, which was to house the offices and dwellings of the staff employed in overseeing the digging of the Sweetwater Canal. The construction project led to several important archaeological finds, many of which are still in the Papenot family collection. Here's Felix Papenot himself. Luckily, he was not a mere art collector. He was a gentleman and a scholar, and he not only collaborated with contemporary Egyptologists such as Gaston Maspero, who published a pair of sphinxes that were found at the site, but also donated some of the monumental finds to the local authorities. Among the monumental statues uncovered by Papenot was a second monolith of the same size and style as the Triad of Ramses II published in the Description de l'Égypte, allowing for the reconstruction of a monumental pair likely flanking an entrance to a Ramesside temple at the site. All of these finds, including a naos called Naos Papenot, a stela of Ramses II, and before-mentioned sphinxes and two granite triads of the same ruler, are currently at the Ismaïlia Museum in Egypt. And here are some of the examples of the finds from Tel Mascuda. Naos Papenot on the left, the stele of Ramses II on the right, one of the sphinxes, too fast, one of the sphinxes published by Gaston Maspero, and the two triads of Ramses II seated between two solar deities, also at Ismaïlia, the Ismaïlia Museum. Following the archaeological free-for-all of the early to mid-1800s, and with the dawn of the 20th century, Wadi Tumilat and Tel Mascuda was now the focal point of systematic archaeological works. First to begin his work at the site was Edward Neville, who in 1883 was the first excavator of the Egypt Exploration Fund, which was set up a year prior by Amelia Edwards and Reginald Stewart Poole as a way to raise funds for more excavations in the Delta, which had been noted as being rarely visited at the time. Neville conducted limited excavations, but still uncovered a large quantity of textual material. He managed to also incorporate previously found objects into his short excavation report, publish a map of the Wadi, listing a number of archaeological sites, the course of an existing canal and railway, as well as the top plan of Tel Mascuda itself. The plan, however simple, shows the location of long-gone ruins that were still visible on the surface in the late 1800s and the course of the Canal of the Pharaohs down below. All right, here, Canal of the Pharaohs, bottom arrow, and the remnants of ruins that are no longer visible on the surface up top. Among the material recorded by Neville were the so-called Pithom stela of Ptolemy II, the Triad of Ramses II, Naos Papenot, containing a Sphinx of Ramses II, a couple of sphinxes, both Hyksos and Ramesside, as well as many fragments of inscribed objects and elements of architecture dating from the Second Intermediate Period to late Roman period. Following Neville, Jean Cléda, a French engineer and archaeologist, worked in the eastern Nile Delta and the Isthmus of Suez between 1901 and 1909. He carried out limited excavations on behalf of the French Institute of Archaeology and the Suez Canal Company. At Tel Mascuda, he reassessed Neville's results and obtained more textual material, including inscribed door hinges, fragments of statues, both in stone and bronze, as well as fragments of monumental limestone relief and inscriptions used in the constructions of the enclosure wall. Unlike Neville, he didn't automatically assume the historicity of the biblical narrative and instead focused on more grounded issues, such as routes of communication and the defensibility of the isthmus and surrounding areas. More importantly, however, Kledai surveyed Wadi Tumilat and the general area of the Isthmus of Suez. He mapped all visible remains of the ancient canal within the Wadi and further south towards Suez. He also considered many possible trade routes connecting Wadi Tumilat with the Near and Middle East while discussing the development of the economic relationship between Egypt and Syria-Palestine. He discovered and mapped several archaeological sites, most of them dating to the Ramesside period, and evaluated the historical situation in the frontier zone. He noticed that what he described as Ramesside fortresses, some of them marked here on the left-hand side, that these fortresses were located along the border of Egypt, both north and south of the eastern mouth of the Wadi, and that they were often accompanied by stelae, likely serving as boundary markers. When possible, he documented these structures and hypothesized about their involvement in long-distance trade and the defensibility of the region. These ruins were not exactly news at the time. They were already reported by scholars like Renan de Bellefonds in 1872, but they never garnered much scientific or scholarly attention until Cléda took a look at them. While the work of the French engineers and later excavators is heavily biased and very often misinterprets the archaeological evidence, the information they recorded turns out to be invaluable in reconstructing the history and archaeology of the Canal of the Pharaohs and the state of preservation at Tel Maskuta before the intensifying agricultural activity managed to disturb many sites which were later identified again by the Wadi Tumilat project. Even looking at the plans drawn by Neville and 2 decades later by Cléda, we can see the progressing deterioration of the site, including the destruction of structures within the enclosure wall and exposure of its northern section, possibly due to the extraction of sebak from the Tel. Now, while still visible, the site is endangered by developing settlements and agriculture, and despite the most recent works at the site focusing on the monumental walls, some of them are still visible on the satellite images, it still requires urgent attention and excavation. And that brings us to today, or rather late 1870s and early 1980s, and the discussion of the results of the Wadi Tumilat project, augmented by my most recent re-evaluation of the site and survey data. It needs to be said that during much of the antiquity, Wadi Tumilat appears to be largely deserted. However, the Wadi Tumilat project survey still managed to locate 71 sites, including 12 tells and possible tells, 44 shared scattered sites with no apparent architecture, 5 canal bank dredging piles, some of which also contained fragments of pottery and other artifacts, and 10 unclassifiable sites. Since the 1980s, more sites have been discovered and contributed to our ever-growing understanding of the settlement pattern in the Wadi. In preparation for the Wadi Tumilat project surveys, the Wadi was divided into 3 so-called divisions, in which 42 transects, 2 by 1 kilometers, were drawn along its southern edge. 14 of these transects were later randomly chosen and subjected to land survey. Additionally, additional information was sourced from a series of interviews with the local farmers and an archival study of both archaeological and geological documentation of the region. In total, 24 sites were recorded in the Western Division, 34 in the Central Division, and only 9 in the Eastern Division. Most sites were stratified and had archaeological remains from several different periods. The Wadi Tumilat project survey showed that while human activity in the Wadi dates back to the Neolithic period, there are only 2 periods in which the Wadi was intensively occupied. The Second Intermediate period, when there was a considerable Hyksos presence in the Central Division, and the late Saite through the early Roman periods. We will circle back to that later, but first let's take a look at the core of my research on this area and begin with the Middle Bronze Age or the Second Intermediate period in Egypt. There were 21 sites with varying concentrations of Middle Bronze Age ceramics recorded in the Wadi, mostly located in the southern section of the central and western divisions, with one large tell in the northern section of each. Major tells and their surrounding auxiliary sites form a general pattern of a large tell, one or two smaller tells, and a number of temporary campsites in between. The larger tells were most likely involved in the far-reaching trade network of the 15th dynasty rulers. Due to the limited arable land in the area, the Middle Bronze Age tells were not entirely self-sufficient, unfortunately. Thus, the auxiliary sites were likely involved in supplementary shepherding, hunting, fishing, agriculture, and procurement of raw materials. Some may also be remnants of camps made by caravans, which were traversing the Wadi quite frequently. What's interesting, only a few second intermediate period sites were located in the western portion of the Western Division, which was the agriculturally favored part of the Wadi Tumilat throughout most of its use, from the pre-dynastic period all the way into the late Roman period. Tel Maskuta was the eastmost large tell in the Wadi Tumilat, and at times the main settlement of the area. It was first settled during the second intermediate period, and then when a relatively large and fast-evolving settlement was established in the mid to late 15th dynasty. After the end of the Hyksos period and their dominance over the delta, Tel Maskuta lost its importance to Tel Retaba, which was located in a more advantageous position. Only a number of Ramesside monuments indicate that some activity took place at the abandoned Tel. After a quite lengthy hiatus, the site was resettled and fortified during the reign of Necho II. In the Persian period, the town site expanded to fill the entire enclosure area and spilled over the walls, further expanding to the southwest. In the Ptolemaic period, the village flourished and was used for storing large quantities of grain. The presence of impressive Ptolemaic granaries was likely another reason why Tel Maskuta was initially identified as the store city of Pithom. The intense occupation continued into the Roman and late Roman period. However, to evaluate its extent, further research is necessary. From the start, Tel Maskuta was an unfortified village, which was probably only 2 to 3 hectares in size, and its archaeology closely parallels that of strata E1 through D3 at Tel Daba, the Hyksos capital. Even though Tel Maskuta was founded much later than Tel Daba, its earliest phases correspond well to those characterizing the beginnings of the older settlement. They are distinguished by sinuous boundary walls, a steady progression of the area uses from above-ground circular silos and intramural burials to an increasingly dense pattern of houses and associated features, mostly related to agriculture, animal husbandry, cooking, and industrial processes. The architecture and material culture of Tel Maskuta correspond to those of Tel Daba, clearly delineating the cultural connections of the inhabitants of Wadi Tumilat with those of the Hyksos capital. However, a local ceramic and some aspects tradition and some aspects of burial customs show influences not attested Tel Daba, but having possible links to cultures present in the inland Levant. In contrast to Tel Maskuta, which was established in one of the wider sections of the Wadi, Tel Retaba was located in a natural narrowing of the valley. It was first settled by the Hyksos, but at the beginning of the 18th dynasty, an important walled Egyptian settlement developed at the same location. The first fortress at Tel Retaba was built by Ramses II. Approximately 100 years later, Ramses III replaced the old stronghold with a new, larger, and better fortified structure. In the third intermediate period, the weakened Egyptian state was unable to maintain the fortress. However, a large, dense settlement developed on its ruins. Tel Retaba was inhabited also in the late period. Thanks to the characteristic types of Tel Yehudia juglets present as grave goods, the earliest second intermediate period burials at Tel Retaba are dated to as early as the 14th dynasty. In comparison, Similar forms are almost entirely absent from the ceramic repertoire at Tel Maskuta, which is characterized by decidedly late forms of this vessel class. Such dating indicates an eastward expansion of the Hyksos settlement pattern into the arid central division of the Wadi in the 15th dynasty, following the initial and continuing settlement at and around Tel Retaba in the 14th dynasty, which may reflect the growing ambitions of the late Hyksos rulers and shifting and intensifying connections with the Levant. During the mid to late 15th dynasty, Tel Maskuta became the primary tel in the area and an important node in the long-distance overland trade. Wadi Tumilat was not an ideal area to settle. It was dry with unreliable access to water. It was removed from the national core and lacked lush pastures of the delta surrounding other Hyksos settlements. The fact that the sites are concentrated, the Hyksos sites are concentrated in the arid and inhospitable location suggests a particular function of the settlement pattern and indicates that we may be dealing with a site system influenced by a major gateway city-type settlement. According to A.F. Burhart, a professor of geography at McMaster University in Hamilton, Ontario, such cities, quote, develop between areas of different intensities and types of production, and they are located towards the end of their tributary areas and are heavily committed to transportation and wholesaling, end quote. Thus, gateway cities are typically located at the entrance to a defined area and will be traversed by anyone coming in or leaving it. By definition, such settlement will be located at the frontier and almost always facilitate connections between the tributary zone and the outside world. Therefore, their service area would be organized differently than that characteristic of central places. They would span outwards away from the national core and reach their maximum density and productivity where the primary settlement was located. Burhart also gave valuable insight into the sequential development of gateway settlements on a pioneer frontier. As the moving frontier crosses a region, gateway cities are spawned along its edge to serve the pioneer area beyond and link it back to the national core. When the frontier has passed by, the formerly exclusively gateway settlements become more and more equipped with central place functions, serving an area more equally poised around them. As the frontier moved eastward during the mid to late 15th dynasty, the settlement pattern grew and became more defined. It is possible that earlier during the second intermediate period, the Wadi Tumilat didn't have a big strategic or economic significance, and that the main settlement overseeing the movement of people, goods, and animals towards and out of the Nile Delta was located further west at Tel Retaba, situated at a natural narrowing of the Wadi. As such, it would be an ideal candidate for such a settlement. However, as the importance of the southern trade route into the Sinai grew, it became instrumental to better facilitate passage through the Wadi Tumilat. It is possible that in order to sustain a settlement located further east, an irrigation canal was at this point in time built along the Wadi, at least until Tel Maskuta. Such a canal would provide an additional mode of transportation and give access to water, which would otherwise not be available in the central division in amounts allowing for both household use and agriculture. The connection of the Wadi Tumilat with both the southern and northern Levant during the 15th dynasty was complex, as evidenced by the ceramic repertoire tested at the site. Imported vessels were present throughout all occupational phases at Tel Maskuta, but the most telling evidence were fragments of painted juglets. Some of them were imported, while most represented local imitations. Among the recorded sherds, parallels to several types of Levantine pottery can be identified, including Levantine painted ware, Syro-Cilician ware, and Cypriot white painted pendant-style juglets. Middle Bronze Age was not the first nor the last period when the Wadi served as a strategically important corridor leading in and out of Egypt, and the Hyksos were not the trailblazers there, nor were they the last ones to cross the Sinai Desert. Thanks to both the preceding and subsequent use of the Wadi as a trade corridor, it is possible to discuss the 15th dynasty route in and out of Egypt in a broader chronological context. This trade route had been active from the pre- and proto-dynastic periods until the early Middle Ages. and at various points in time relied more or less heavily on the transport via the Canal of the Pharaohs as an additional way to facilitate the movement of goods and people. But let's backtrack for a second. While the presence of a waterway definitely helped develop trade in the Wadi Tumilat, the exchange of goods and ideas across the desert was possible as early as in the Epipaleolithic and evolved through the Neolithic and Chalcolithic into the early Bronze Age. Focused on the procurement of copper, trade in these periods might have already been conducted along more than one route. Unfortunately, we don't have time to unpack this topic today. Following the occupation in the Neolithic and pre-dynastic periods, Wadi Tumilat was deserted for the large majority of the Old and Middle Kingdoms. It was only with the arrival of the Hyksos in the Second Intermediate period it saw a rapid increase in occupation. After the fall of the Hyksos, written evidence indicates that Wadi Tumilat belonged to a military zone known as Cheku. Both the orthography of the word and the context of the references implied that Cheku was a district rather than a town, although its specific boundaries are impossible to be determined at this point. During the New Kingdom, Wadi Tumilat was sparsely populated. According to the Wadi Tumilat project surveys, there was only one major active tell. However, written sources suggest a more complex network of fortifications. Identification of particular fortifications mentioned in the New Kingdom tags of archaeological sites is difficult. The one exception is the fortress of Merenptah-hetep Herma'at of Papyrus Anastasi VI, which can be equated with Tel Rataba with some confidence. However, Tel Rataba was not the only site where Ramesside monuments were found. At Tel Maskuta, a number of contemporary monuments was present, despite the lack of occupational strata during the New Kingdom. Among them were a pair of sphinxes, a naos, a massive stele of Ramses II, and two triads of the same ruler, all of which should look really familiar to you by now. The earliest writing of Cheku occurs on an inscription at Serabit al-Hadim in the Sinai, dated to the 7th year of Thutmose IV. The inscription belonged to Amenemhet, the troop commander of Cheku, who was also a royal messenger. It is worth noting that the earliest known writing of Cheku is attached to the name of a military commander, as might be expected given the strategic nature of this entryway into Egypt. Such high military officers associated with Cheku are further documented in the Ramesside Papyrus Anastasi V. Commander Kakemwer of Cheku, here translated by Gardner as the chief of bowmen, is dispatched from the royal palace, presumably in Pi-Ramses, to pursue runaway workers or slaves who fled from the royal palace towards Wadi Tumilat. In his report, he writes that he reached Pas Seger and Cheku, the Seger fort of Cheku. Interestingly, the Egyptian word Seger possibly derives from Semitic Segor or some similar form, meaning a keep, fortress, or enclosure, which may indicate its past as a Hyksos settlement. This fort in Cheku is not the same one as the Hetem fort, aka fortification of Merenptah-hetep Herma'at, mentioned in Anastasi VI, which could have been located somewhere around the Isthmus of Suez. These mentions are very promising, especially considering the Ramesside fortresses reported by Cleda along the Isthmus of Suez. The presence of Ramesside settlements and military installations in the Isthmus of Suez and even at the verge of the Sinai Desert are not surprising considering the New Kingdom role of Wadi Tumilat in conducting long-distance trade or facilitating expeditions seeking raw materials. The course of the route can be broadly reconstructed based on the inscriptions of Ramses III from Wadi Abu Ghada in the Sinai and Temilat Redadi in southern Negev. While the use of Wadi Tumilat in copper trade is not exactly new, a third inscription found in Taima in Saudi Arabia shows the extent of the far-reaching trade at the time and explains the development of the robust fortification at Tel Rataba. It is likely that the route used during the reign of Ramses III did not come out of nowhere and was a result of a pre-existing, possibly smaller scale route already present during the reign of Ramses II, which could explain the presence of the two monumental triads dedicated to Ramses II found at Tel Maskuda, as well as the stelae and architectural remains located along the way south towards the Gulf of Suez. It seems that in the New Kingdom, the southern route might have been a reflection of the better studied and definitely better known ways of Horus, the military and trade routes running along the Mediterranean coast into the Levant. The relatively lower number of fortifications in the Wadi Tumilat can indicate a lower military priority, as well as it was unlikely that a large army would traverse the challenging terrain of the Sinai Peninsula had any other options been available at the time. It is also plausible that an attack from the desert was not considered a real possibility. To summarize, the intensity of settlement in the Wadi Tumilat fluctuated over time and may reflect several factors impacting the choice of location within the Wadi, climatic and hydrological conditions, political situation, as well as the presence and intensity of long-distance trade. Notice that only after the Canal of the Pharaohs was completed by Darius I and later used during the Greco-Roman period, the entirety of the Wadi was occupied. Before fresh water became available, the eastern division would not be habitable. Rainfall in the Wadi Tumilat is sparse, erratic, and insufficient to sustain the settled occupation. The ordinary Nile floods regularly reached the western section of the Wadi, which was bounded by a large natural dike near Tel Rataba and the modern Kasassin. Only exceptionally high floods reached the central and eastern sections of the Wadi, replenishing Lake Timsa to the east and the many small lakes which were located in the central section of the Wadi. That's why the western end of the Wadi was more heavily alluviated and had more arable land, thus being able to support a larger number of sites. The depressed western region of the Wadi probably contained a perennially marshy lake sustained by the yearly Nile flood. In the end, the name of the seventh Lower Egyptian nome, the Eastern Harpoon, suggests a place where a hunt by harpoons should be possible. In pharaonic times, it is not attested whether the lake subsequently slowly dried up or whether it was fed by a Nile canal also outside of the flood season. Economic activities such as farming, grazing, hunting, and fishing in and around the lake could sustain permanent occupation in the area, unlike the arid and inhospitable Eastern Division. Even settling in the Central Division posed some challenges. However, the two tells located in that part of the Wadi prospered for centuries and show evidence of more or less continuous occupation. While the caravan trade thrived in the early and Middle Bronze Age, the scale of international trade was greatly influenced and amplified by the presence and reach of the so-called Canal of the Pharaohs. Unfortunately, due to limited research and despite my ongoing efforts, the extent of the trade network involving Wadi Tumilat at any given time is not well known and requires dedicated work, including further large-scale surveys along possible trade routes across central Sinai. The fact that the Wadi was an important trade corridor cannot be contested. The direction of such route can also be inferred from numerous finds in the Wadi. However, the course of the overland trade route remains somewhat of a mystery. Caravans crossed the Sinai from the early days of the Egyptian civilization. Even with the climatic conditions during the early Bronze Age being less arid than those characterizing Middle and Late Bronze Age, traversing the desert was still a difficult feat that required ample resources, experience, and most importantly, access to potable water. Based on the past and current geological maps of the Sinai Peninsula, numerous wells and sources of water can be mapped. They were present not only along the well-known ways of Horus, as the Karnak reliefs indicate, but seem to be located along the projected routes leading to both southwestern and southeastern Sinai, as well as across the central Sinai towards the Negev Desert and the Jordan Valley. Now, an average donkey caravan aiming to cover several hundred kilometers in arid or semi-arid regions could reach an average daily rate of travel of approximately 25 to 40 kilometers, with a load weight of about 50 to 80 kilos per donkey. Taking the lowest values into account, an experienced caravan could reach either Timna, Feinan, or Beersheba in less than 14 days. Sarabit al-Hadim in 10, Wadi Tar in 12, and the cluster of southern Sinai sites in 2 weeks. With the furthest distance between geologically feasible sources of water being approximately 70 kilometers, it is theoretically possible to follow this route all the way across. The possibility of trade routes traversing the central Sinai as early as in the early Bronze Age calls for a detailed land survey similar to those conducted by Oren in the north and the Ophir expedition in the south of the peninsula. While such an expedition is yet to take place, recently developed techniques such as digital elevation modeling and remote sensing were implemented by Stewart et al. To extract anthropogenic features in the desert region using data from the first and second generation phased array type L-band synthetic aperture radar, or PULSAR 1 and 2. The resulting photo mosaic showed a clear difference between the geological formations and the anthropogenic features, such as roads and buildings, which were clearly visible as high reflective targets. Consequently, it was possible to detect man-made features in the desert environment and evaluate the presence of buried structures. And while it doesn't mean those structures can be dated to the antiquity, their physical evaluation would be more than justified. Of particular interest are features identified between Wadi Tumilat and Jebel Magara, a sparsely developed hyper-arid area, strategically located at a crossing point between routes and settlements that lie along the Wadi Tumilat. In this region, the pulsar mosaic revealed many particularly linear anomaly features indicating a possible presence of buried roads. The Pulsar 1 mosaic of the area east of Ismaïlia showed a multitude of buried or semi-buried linear and nonlinear features which are in line with the theoretical interpretation of the settlement pattern in the Wadi Tumilat in the Middle Bronze Age, as well as the activity in the region during the Ramesside period. Even given the presence of trade-oriented Middle Bronze Age settlement pattern in the Wadi Tumilat and evidence of widespread and intense contact with different regions of the Levant present at Tel Maskuda, the question of the Middle Bronze Age trade route and its course remains open. Studying imported pottery alone can't really paint a complete picture, and much more work remains to be done in order to evaluate the extent of the connections between Wadi Tumilat and the inland Levant, the Negev Desert, and the Jordan Valley via the Sinai Peninsula. The pulsar data shows that roads across the desert did exist. Whether they can connect these regions, however, remains to be seen. Bearing in mind that the ways of Horus had little significance during the Second Intermediate period, the bulk of land trade could have passed through the Wadi Tumilat along a major overland route. With little tangible evidence, the logistics of such a connection are likely the key to understanding of the nature of such a route. What was the extent of the southern Middle Bronze Age trade route between Egypt and the Levant? Where did it lead exactly, and what local economic and/or cultural boundaries did it cross? Which commodities could be traded by land? It is likely that if such a route existed, Wadi Tumilat would have played a major role in facilitating the exchange of commodities difficult to trade by sea, such as large numbers of cattle, or goods manufactured in specific geographical locations away from the shore. Then, to what extent is the Middle Bronze Age trade route reflected in the later and better documented New Kingdom network? If parts or its entirety, as well as Second Intermediate period sites located along its way, were adapted and expanded in the Ramesside period, as was the case of the sparse Middle Bronze settlement along the ways of Horus, maybe it is possible to hypothesize about its reach and direction. Building on my doctoral research, this study is still in its preliminary stages and definitely requires more work, ideally including a systematic, targeted survey of the Wadi Tumilat and the Isthmus of Suez. Ideally. However, I remain hopeful that as I dig my way through the archives of the Wadi Tumilat project itself, eventually I will shed more light on the organization and functioning of the larger Hyksos trade network. Thank you. That was a lot of information.
Thank you so much for a very exciting lecture. Would you be willing to take some questions?
Absolutely.
Okay. Are there any questions in the audience? Okay, 1 second. Because we're live streaming, you have to say it into here.
Mainly, it was about one of the artifacts you found. It was about the statuette with Ramses and the two sun gods next to him, I believe is what it was.
Excuse me?
It was about the statue you found with Ramsey in the middle and the two sun gods on the side.
They were almost exactly the same. So it was Ra, Atum, and the king.
Got it. Yes.
Both of them.
But yeah,
The
so
matching pairs, yeah.
were they pointed in a certain direction for any significance, or was it just normally like set up how it was in the rock face?
That's a very good question. They were likely not placed in their finding spot during the Ramesside period. They were likely moved around, considering the later occupation of the site after the New Kingdom. So we don't know if they were in their original orientation. Also, nobody really documented where exactly they found them, so that's also a mystery.
Other questions? I have a question.
Go ahead.
So they are on the edges of the desert, right? Into
That's
the
correct.
Sinai. Do you have any evidence for pastoral nomads that they might have run into?
So, not exactly. The only evidence of the transhuman population leaving the Wadi or coming to the Wadi are the small camps that are scattered across the entire valley from all of the periods, starting in the Middle Bronze Age, through the New Kingdom, and later. There's a number of camps and smaller settlements that were very temporary, so they could be, at least part of them, remnants of the nomads passing. But the best evidence is the Ramesside mentions of the Shasu Bedouin coming into the Wadi to water their animals.
Other questions? Excellent. Here you are.
So throughout your research, personally, did you spend time in that region? And if so, how long?
Unfortunately, I have never been to the Wadi Tumilat. All of my research is based in the archives, so I spent a lot of time in a very dusty room, but not on site, unfortunately. But I do hope to go there one day and re-excavate it. Because what we know about the occupation of the site comes from only about 4% of the tell. It was only partially excavated. So there's a lot of room for improvement.
We also have a question from Zoom, or
Okay.
from YouTube, excuse me. It says that Brian Kramer did not catch what the evidence was for the irrigation canal. So can you talk about the evidence for the irrigation canal to bring the water to the Wadi Tumilat as far as Tel El Maskuda in the Second Intermediate Period?
Right, so there is none. There's no physical evidence of that canal being there for many reasons. There's very little evidence of the canal of the Pharaohs itself. The bed of the canal was taken over by modern canals, largely destroyed. So at present, there's nothing left of any of the ancient canals. My expectation for the irrigation canal to be present in the Wadi Tumilat as early as the Second Intermediate Period is just that it would be impossible to have a site functioning to the extent at which Tel Maskuta functioned without access to potable water. And there is no wells, very little access to a sustainable source of water. So it must have been brought in from somewhere, and the canal is the most logical explanation. Additionally, there are mentions of smaller canals in the New Kingdom sources. For instance, there was a canal running along the ways of Horus itself called Tajanit, meaning the dividing waters, which reached maybe 1/3 of the way along the ways of Horus, and then they would have to get off the boat and continue on foot. But smaller canals did accompany trade routes at least as early as the New Kingdom.
Any other questions? Well, with that, thank you so much for this lovely lecture.
All right, thank you for being here.
And for members of the audience, please make sure you check out the rest of the museum before you guys run away. It's really a lovely space. Are the calaveras open or no? So definitely check out the beautiful Festival of the Calaveras on the other side, one of whom was in fact created by our speaker today. Or did you want to talk about
And also, if you're my student, please find your attendance list and sign your name on it.
And if you're my student, find the attendance list and sign your name on it. Thank you so much for coming tonight, and please come again.
Thank you for listening. It was a lot of information.